Hey, you. Yeah, you. What you doing? I know what I'm doing. I'm starting off right with Talking About the Blues podcast, baby.
What's going on, good folks? You are now blues, and we're talking about the blues, the number one blues podcast in New York City. Today, I'm very excited because, as you know, we celebrate our heritage and we preserve blues music as well as history. And a big part of blues heritage and history came from literature. The Zora Neale Hurstons, the Spellmans, the Langston Hughes, the who else? So many cats. I can't think of everybody off the top of my head right now. Why am I talking about that? What does that have to do with today's podcast? Well, we have Brother Teyhimba Jess, and he falls into that category of a poet, literature writer, African American literature, and his voice is used to discuss blues and preserve our heritage. We met at the Leadbelly Fest, and he's also written a very, very successful book, poetry book, based on Leadbelly's songs. He's going to explain it more and better than I can. Brother Teyhimba, what's going on?
Hey, how you doing?
I'm okay, man. I'm okay. I'm blues, and it's raining. The perfect day for the blues.
Right.
So let's just jump right into it. And before we discuss your journey as a writer, uh, preserving African American heritage through your writing, let's talk about your Leadbelly poetry book.
Okay.
Could you give us a brief summary of it and then explain to us the inspiration behind it?
Right. The book Leadbelly is about Footy Ledbetter, who was born in mid 1880s, died in 1949. He here in New York City. He was the quintessential folk musician and blues man. He was born in Louisiana, spent a lot of his life in Texas, then moved here to New York, do 500 songs off the top of his head, more or less. Was called the king of the 12-string guitar. And what the book does is it basically follows his life, through poems that are in the perspective of Leadbelly himself and people and objects around him. Yes. So it's a book of persona poems that cover many different aspects of his life, from his boyhood in the South through his prison journeys. He served time in both Sugar Land and in Angola prisons, and ends up with his introduction to and residence in New York.
So now you mentioned something that I would like you to expand upon briefly. You said it's about him and different objects around him. What did you mean by that?
Well, in the book, there's pictures. There's poems in the voice of, for instance, his guitar, the first gun that he owned that he used in a murder, from the perspective of a recording machine that was in the back of John Lomax's car. There's also poems in the voice of John Lomax, who was the ethnomusicologist that Leadbelly met while he was in prison.
Right.
Also poems or two in the voice of his wife, and also in the voices of characters that he met along through his life. So it's mostly all in first person. It's almost all of it is in first person, but it's about, I'd say probably about 50% Leadbelly and 50% everybody else.
That's groovy. What inspired you to tackle it that way?
Well, when you read a persona poem, yeah, it's in first person, so you automatically start to identify with the speaker. So in that respect, it becomes a lot easier to tell the story of someone else because the reader is automatically relating to it, and I guess also it's a unique way to experience a historical subject.
Let's talk about how your writing is paralleled with the blues because, like the aforementioned writers I mentioned in your intro, they spoke about what was going on in the black community at the time, which was blues. So, talk to me about the importance of art, writing, literature, preserving our history and our heritage.
Well, I would say that history for me is interesting in that well, I think black people have always had a particular interest in history, in particularly because so much of our history was taken away from us, and we've been trying to reconstruct it ever since we've had any ability to do so. So I guess you could say that the songs and the literature are intimately connected because for the first couple hundred years or so that we were in this country, we were not allowed to read and write. So all of our old literature, I should say literature from the continent, was kind of stuffed into the melodies that we preserved from the continent and applied to words in English that told stories that tried to approximate what we knew or what we came here with, the legends and the stories and the histories that we came here with. So essentially, the music was our first literature, and after emancipation, we started to really, try and unearth our personal histories. So, some of them being, where's my family member who was sold away 20 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, and try and retrace that history. And then it became more community based. How are we? What is our relationship to the continent, and what is our relationship to the history here in the United States, and what are the realities behind the historical perspectives that we've been fed from the textbooks that we have, and so it continues from there. The purpose of writing about history, I think, is in order to remind us really where we've been, so that we can understand where we are and we can better understand where the options we have in terms of where we're headed.
Right.
And that's what I'm interested in when I'm studying Leadbelly and history.
I dig it. Now, you come from Detroit, which is a heavy music town.
Right.
So,
yeah.
So,
Yeah.
what was your experience or inspiration into writing, and was blues or rhythm and blues a factor in that?
Well, I grew up in Detroit, so there's a heavy Motown influence and a lot of R&B.
Mm-hmm.
But then I really spent about 18 years in the city of Chicago.
Mm.
And so Chicago, as I guess many of your listeners know, is a heavy blues town. It's really more of an industry in Chicago than, maybe most places. Probably just as much as Memphis, not, maybe as much as New Orleans, but Chicago blues is an industry.
Yes, it sure is.
There's several bars that feature blues, and there's a blues festival there. And I haven't lived in Chicago for over a dozen years now, but it was more of a blues scene when I was there in the 1980s through the early 2000s.
Mm.
And so I was able to see, Buddy Guy, Lefty Diz, Junior Wells.
Wow.
All those guys performing and just killing it,
Mm-hmm.
So I would go to the blues clubs, and that was when it would become really clear to me what the magic with the blues was.
Mm.
So it rubbed off on me a lot more in Chicago.
Understood. So what was it? A piece? Was it a poetry piece? What was it? Rakim and Eric B. What was it that struck you that this is how I have to express myself and represent my culture?
Yeah, I grew up around a lot of books, and I read a lot as a kid, and I think that really influenced me quite a bit. And listening to or reading Langston Hughes and Mary Baraka,
Mm-hmm.
and Henry Dumas,
Mm.
Sonia Sanchez, Wanda Coleman, Jane Cortez,
Mm.
Patricia Smith, so many, Sterling Brown.
Yes.
And then really encountering a poet that helped me out quite a bit when I was in Chicago, named Sterling Plump, who's probably the foremost blues poet in the country.
Wow.
And studying under him really shaped my understanding of the role that literature can play, and the kind of energy that literature can summon from a community.
Mm. Mm. It's deep, and that's very, very heavy, and that thus began your journey. So now, you have a lot of accomplishments, even prior to the Leadbelly piece that you have. So let's talk about, wow, there's a few to pick from. You have Young Black Men in Love and Violence. Then there's Celebrating Our Achievements, Contributions, and Enduring Legacies. Why don't, if you can, well, not if you can, because I know you can, but if you don't mind, break down some of these projects that you wrote and why you found them important in preserving and celebrating our history and heritage.
Well, I've been publishing poems since, I guess I would say, the mid '90s.
Mm-hmm.
Well, really since the early '90s, and I think that my impetus has always been, self-expression, obviously, and to try and master a craft that you never really master for your entire life. That it places a challenge to try and do so. You always end up just further honing your craft.
Right.
So, the my major works are really Leadbelly. I also slammed for a few years in Chicago. I would go on. I was part of a slam team at the Green Mill. Before that, I would publish in anthologies and in journals, and I would try to go to open mics and slams, and that's how I really kind of started out. And it just kind of blossomed from there. And Leadbelly came out in 2005, I think.
Yes.
And right now, my newest book is called Olio, and it really involves that bridge between the Civil War and World War I, between the Emancipation Proclamation and the beginning of the recording industry, to try and examine African American entertainers before the era of recording.
Very interesting.
So it takes blues. It takes really the music before blues was marketed as blues,
right?
So to speak.
Right.
So ragtime, spirituals, and
prison songs.
Prison songs, work songs. You know, it's really about entertainers performing in those genres. Really in the era just before, I can't remember when W.C. Handy came out with St. Louis Blues.
Right.
But around that time,
Right, before classic blues, as Amiri Baraka termed it,
right,
became...
Before blues were being recorded.
Right.
And marketed as such. Yeah.
Right, when it was just on the plantation.
The funny thing about these genres is, we can never really say exact. There was no one inventor, so to speak, that we know of the blues. But there's a conglomeration of traditions that kind of meld and form into what we know as the blues over a period of years. And there's performers that are kind of milestones along that path.
Right, right. I agree. Hey, I have a question for you because, man, I'm really happy you brought this up. Have you ever read the book In Search of the Blues?
Yeah. Yeah, I have. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I have too. Man, I really want to ask you why you answered that way, but I don't want to put you on the spot on the air.
No. I mean, I've read it. It's been a while ago. I have it on my bookshelf. Pretty sure I have it on my bookshelf somewhere right now. But it's been a minute since I read it. I mean, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I asked because based on, matter of fact, I have it right here. It's been a while since I read it, but I actually wrote an article and referred back to it. What is this? Maribeth Hamilton, and her thesis, at least based on my understanding and recollection, was the blues was that wasn't the name of it. This was just the culture in our community that white men, pretty much as how she put it, chased it down and somehow try to market it and preserve it. She spoke about John Lomax, Papa John, in terms of trying to hold on to Southern antebellum, as well as another lady, I can't remember her name. I bring this book up because, again, her thesis to me, as it sounds like, these dreamy, nostalgic white men had an agenda, you know, and that it was just a cultural expression that they wrapped up and packaged and tried to sell, and that's how the term the blues came. What is your take on that, based on this book that you've written and the information and research you've done?
Well, I know that one of the concepts behind the blues is bending a note, and that to bend a note is to blue a note, to take it from a major into a minor,
Right.
and to be able to blue the note. So, you know, I think that I guess what I would say, my understanding of the development of blues is that we were probably singing or developing. I don't have the exact chronology of performers,
Right.
but that we were making blues before it was called the blues, and probably what happened along the way is that when it started being recorded, I think the first one was the Crazy Blues, wasn't it?
Yeah.
When it started being recorded, and I mean it becomes subject to the forces of a capitalist market,
Right.
and the people in control of that market are going to do what they want or need to do, or they perceive they need to do in order to make it successful. So, to some degree, the music industry. I mean, clearly it has a reputation for being one of the least trustworthy industries. So, when you have people coming in and trying to make music, they're going to or trying to make money off the music. They're going to foist all kinds of trappings upon the original art form that may or may not have necessarily been there in the first place. They're
Right.
going to emphasize what sells. And they're going to emphasize also the stories that make the musicians more palatable or more
Marketable. Somebody
interesting and marketable. Like, for instance, with Leadbelly, his situation was he was found by, the ethnomusicologists would like to say he found
Right.
Leadbelly. What happened is he was in prison, and the ethnomusicologist John Lomax, who really is probably, if not the one of America's most impactful ethnomusicologists, between him and his son. Now,
Yeah.
there's no way to take that distinction away from him.
No, I
One
would
of his
definitely put John Wesley work 1, 2, and 3 in that conversation. But
Right.
yes, go ahead.
Right. I'm just saying, So, but the thing is, he was an innovator in that he would go around with an acetate disc in the back of his pickup truck, a 500-pound recording machine.
Yes.
And instead of sitting down and painstakingly asking people to sing a song over and over and over again and taking notes about exactly what note they were singing and how they were singing it, he would actually record them, which was very new back in the early 1930s, because that technology was very new.
Yes.
So he was groundbreaking in that way. And when he went into a prison and found this guy who could sing 500 songs off the top of his head, and who could play excellent 12-string guitar, he knew he had a find.
Mm-hmm.
And when that gentleman named Hoodie Ledbetter got out of prison later on and looked up John Lomax, he decided that he was going to try and work with this ex-convict and go around the country and recording people on plantations and in prisons, black people on plantations and prisons, in order to capture this sound that was, this sound it was really the first time that the songs that had been passed down through generations, or in some case, firsthand, passing down from people that had been on plantations in slavery days.
Right.
So,
Right.
the problem, so that was a very that's a critical thing, work that John Lomax was doing. The only problem started to arise when John started to morph into Leadbelly's agent, so to speak. And that started to occur more. What happened is Leadbelly and John, they started off, they would go to a prison, and they would and Leadbelly would sing some songs on his guitar to try and coax songs out of other people.
Right.
So people would end up feeling very comfortable about leaving their songs on this disc, which was really new technology.
Very new.
And they would start to contribute their songs. And later on, they kind of changed their way of their modus operandi, and what they decided to do was to go and start touring at colleges and in various venues across the United States, where Leadbelly would demonstrate his prowess with the guitar and his singing. And they eventually ended up in New York in the 1930s, more or less in the middle of the Harlem Renaissance.
Right.
And Leadbelly, not exactly a country hick, so to speak, but had been no place as big as New York with as many black people doing as many things as they were in Harlem at the time. Was entranced, and he wanted to. The critical difference became that he wanted to expand his musical vocabulary, and Lomax wanted to preserve him as a historical artifact.
Right.
So Leadbelly would want to, stay out all night, carousing and hanging with these musicians, this brand new community of musicians and artists that he had stumbled upon in New York. He would want to hang out and play with them, and Lomax would say, well, no, you have to be in by 11 p.m. or whatever, and you can't party with your Negro friends.
Right.
And we need to be at Sarah Lawrence College at 7:00 in the morning or whatever, And that was not, and Leadbelly's response would be, well, I didn't learn 500 songs off the top of my head by coming home at midnight, and that ended up causing some friction between the two of them, and eventually they split, to make a long story short.
Right.
And Leadbelly first went back to Texas, and then he ended up taking his wife Martha with him and coming back to New York, and that's where he lived the rest of his days throughout the 40s, the late 30s and the 40s.
Right. Matter of fact.
But I think that Lomax is an example of both Leadbelly's interaction with anthropology and with the recording industry. Because, another thing that I really wasn't able to put in the book was that Lomax was creating this book called Leadbelly's Songbook. And you can still find copies of this book around today. But it was a big, beautiful songbook, and basically it was all of Leadbelly's songs, in a book, transcribed.
Right.
Along, accompanied by Lomax's remembrances of Leadbelly, et cetera, et cetera. And really, frankly, Lomax was not very kind in his depiction of Leadbelly throughout the book.
Right.
And one of the reasons he was not kind about it was because at a certain point, Leadbelly found out that Lomax was putting this book together, and he wanted really essentially a piece of the action.
Rightfully
And
so.
yeah, and rightfully so. I mean, there were songs that Lomax would not have known anything about without that belly. So he wanted a piece of the action. And he was savvy enough to contact a lawyer and take the man to court over.
Mm.
And Lomax lost,
Mm.
and he had to share his he had to he had to strike a settlement, I think, with Leadbelly. And so he 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 was a little bitter about that. He thought that he should just be entitled to take his work. But that's not unlike, most
Record
many
execs.
many black musicians experience with the recording industry and with royalties, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Getting ripped off and having, credit for songs stolen from them. That intellectual property
Hmm.
being heisted.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I really like how you put that, and that's 100%. Almost, the way you explained it is almost as if John Lomax wrote the blueprint for the record industry.
yeah, something like that. I mean, there are black performers. I mean, I talk about, if you want to really take it back a half a step and step out of the genre. Scott Joplin
Oh,
was
absolutely.
ripped off by Irving Berlin.
Yes, yes, he
So
was.
and that was in 1915.
Yeah,
So it's 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 uh it's when you're dealing with ideas, musical ideas. We see a lot of these situations, playing out today. We just, had a situation with Marvin Gaye, right?
that's right.
And I forget the artist that lost the court case,
Um,
but
it was Marvin. It was
it was
Pharrell
Pharrell.
and uh, Robin Thicke.
That other, yeah, and Robin Thicke. They had to pay. So really, you're seeing, the same things happening 100 years ago, literally 100 years ago, that are happening today.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. And I want to touch on that, but before we touch on that, I have to bring this up based on the content of this new book that you're working on. Did you find it odd, or did you even touch on the fact that the new Negroes, the W.E.B. Du Boises, and those elites were frowning upon or trying to what's the word? Trying to erase uh, blues, or as if, since how you put it, country hick type folk out of the history of African Americans in this land during the time that you're studying, that you're writing about.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, yeah, if we talk about W.B. Du Bois in particular, I think you know, he was a complicated character. I mean,
Mm,
he had this notion of the talented tenth,
right,
which which uh, which I guess the equivalent of saying the talented tenth today would be to talk about black respectability politics.
right,
And he carried a notion that 10% of the population will carry the burden of most of the improvement or in political and social advances of the entire race.
right.
So you know, not necessarily a very democratic, philosophy, so to speak. But on the other hand, I will say this about Du Bois: he was one of the first people to publish Zora Hurston and Langston Hughes,
Right,
and by embracing their use of vernacular and their understanding of blues culture, you could say that culturally he was aligned with the idea of preserving their voices. So you know, I really have to say that um, perhaps this is something I should explore more. I think the question that you're asking is very intriguing, and that it's one that I can only point to kind of a duality of consciousness with W.B. Du Bois.
Right. I'd agree with that, with him specifically, because he did publish them. But at the same token,
but to speak to the larger community, there were a lot of people, who really, didn't want anything to do with the blues, anything to do with that down home music, because it was down home back where a lot of atrocities occurred, and I think really, blues, I think in particular, has suffered from a stigma, in that there's a lot of black folks that really have not wanted to be associated with those old country blues, because there's some kind of association with minstrelsy in their minds regarding the blues. It couldn't be really further from the truth, but that is part of
the stigma,
struggle of the blues.
Yeah,
I would say, for instance, part of it stems from the fact that it was considered the devil's music.
Right.
It is a music that celebrates hoodoo and voodoo, and it's really celebrating and engaging in dialogue and remembrance of African spiritual traditions from the continent.
Right.
So when you, it's really there's a time when blues guitar men could not bring their guitar into churches. Although, really, frankly, the fact of the matter is that most of those cats could play gospel songs as good as they could play the blues. There's not one. I don't think there's not one single blues guitarist from back in the day that couldn't sing out a gospel song. And really, the other fact of the matter is that the blues was based on, let's just say, gospel is really taken straight from the blues. I'm trying to remember the name of the gentleman, the Reverend.
Gary Davis?
No, in Chicago. They started the blues.
Well, we're talking about the composers that composed and published gospel and blues, and he was running up and down the street to different churches, and then at night he was running around to different
yeah.
I know who you're talking about. I can't think of his name off the top of my head. I know exactly who you're talking about. I know exactly who you're talking about. The irony, see, and this goes back to how stories are told, because the story is told as if he was dancing between worlds and finding a way to make money dancing between worlds. I believe he wrote music for Mahalia Jackson as well. But the blues and spirituals are literally the same. One just has an instrument, one doesn't. Gospel, rhythm and blues, they were all birthed from those two musics. It was just expanded, And to your point, a lot of Africanism is in the blues, and I have to wonder if that's even not just spiritual speaking, but just the entire rhythmic structure of it, right? Because it's really
well, the person I'm trying to think of is Thomas Dorsey,
right?
Who was a blues musician and really was struggling between gospel and blues, and had an epiphany at a certain moment when his wife and his child died in childbirth, and composed the song "Precious Lord, Take My Hand."
Right.
Right. But he's considered the father of gospel music. He was a blues musician.
Well,
So
they're the same.
they're right up against each other. They're really pretty much the same music. It's just that one is talking about a kind of secular life, and the other one is talking about a spiritual life. Now, what I'm going to say is based off of that experience. I would say that blues is more mainstream in Chicago than it is in New York.
Mm.
And part of it has to do with the migration patterns.
Mm.
In Chicago, you have an entire population of black people. I would say probably about 80, at least, okay, let me not be so extreme. I would say at least 70% of the black people in Chicago have roots in Mississippi.
Right.
Okay? Because people would get on the train and they go directly north.
Right.
And however much money they had determined how far they went.
Mm.
And there was so straight from Louisiana all the way up to Chicago, taking that train, getting off in Chicago with a suitcase, settling down in the black section town on the south side. They took their music with them. And then because of the environment, and because of because they had to compete with a lot of noise, the instruments and play in noisy bars, the instruments became electrified, and you have the birth of what is known as Chicago blues,
right?
Electric blues, right? And in New York, it's a different situation. New York is at this point, I would say, well, you live here as well as I do, but
right.
I would say probably. If you're black in the city of New York, I would bet you have at least a 60 to 65% chance of having a Caribbean relative or forebear.
Right.
Would you say that's roughly correct?
Yeah.
Right.
I would.
And also the migration pattern from the south is from North Carolina, South Carolina, and that's really that's what you call more of a Piedmont blues.
Right.
And it's more it's a little more folksy, so to speak. It's more built on finger picking.
Right.
And it has a different sound to it. Okay. And so, but it's more in the folk category than the Chicago blues is, so to speak. You know what I'm saying?
I know. I get you.
So. In New York, I think you have a lower tolerance or a lower appreciation of what I would call, those old Mississippi Delta, blues, and there's more of an emphasis on Caribbean music, jazz, which is huge here in New York.
New York is a big
like
jazz
for instance
town.
when James Reese Europe was putting together his band for the Hell Rate, the 369th.
Right.
He went to the Dominican Republic and to Cuba and Puerto Rico, I think, to get the bulk of his musicians and brought them over to the United States to play. You know what I'm saying? So there's a real Caribbean heritage to this music that is not in the lineage, in the actual, lineage of Mississippi and those southern blues like you have in Chicago. So really, in New York, they don't have the same appreciation.
Mm. But I have to ask you a question based on what you just said. I have to ask you this because I really appreciate that breakdown, and that was the first time it was broken down like that. And I have to say that you're right. I grew up in Brooklyn, which is heavily Caribbean, and I've been all over. I lived in Queens. I've been all over New York City, and it's heavily Caribbean.
Right.
Now, Bed-Stuy is a mirror of Harlem, which at one time was heavily African American, but meaning none of them stopped in the, well, we all stopped in the Caribbean, but we're country Southern blacks rather than, right? Now, with that being said, the North, East, New York City, Wall Street, that, you know, we know the history of that. We know the history of New York City. We know that those who moved north was moving north to get rid or leave that part of themselves and their family behind. Do you think that plays a part in why it's not here? Because New York is like a metropolis.
Well, yeah, I think New York is about a claim towards sophistication.
Right.
And I think that to a certain degree, when we're talking about leaving the past behind, or leaving those country ways behind, in New York it means part of what that might have meant, say, in the early part of the 20th century, was to eschew that kind of Southern sound,
right,
so to speak, right? And that was true also in Chicago, but like at the same time in Chicago, you had, like we were just talking about, the birth of gospel music, which is
right,
really, the same thing as the blues. So you still have that sound there,
right,
and it's just not the same, intensity here in New York. And I love New York and I love Chicago. It's just a fact it's just what I have observed.
right.
And having been here now, having lived here for 7 years, I started asking myself what was the difference between the two cities, and that's pretty much what I came up with.
Okay.
In Chicago, I mean, there are multiple blues clubs that you can regularly access, and really, there used to be more, but that's not really the same here in New York. There's not as many venues in New York, so if you just look at it statistically, there's just not as many places for the blues to launch.
The real blues. Let's be clear, because there's a lot of places that say blues, but is heavily jazz. Now,
exactly.
Right.
Exactly. It's like I mean, in this, no offense to New York or to any place. It's just an observation. Is that like the understanding of what blues is not as down home and gritty as what you would find in Chicago.
Right.
And even in Chicago, you can't hardly find any acoustic blues, which is a whole nother situation.
Right.
Right. But here in New York, there's this drive towards what is perceived to be sophistication.
Right.
And it is sophisticated music, jazz is, but it's also, it's not as into the blues as that I know and love as Chicago is.
Right, and how jazz started, because it was blues on piano and it graduated to brass. So it is, and that goes into, it's just what it is. It goes into the mesh of Euroism and classical music, because they were able to notate the music. It was a technical difference with blues and jazz. But let me ask you this question to piggyback off the Caribbeanness and sophistication of New York City. Blues, right? Do you think a portion of that is because the face of the blues has changed drastically and dramatically?
Oh yeah, definitely. I have to say that's another part of it is that if you go into even in Chicago, you go into any blues club today, as a black person, you might be the only person ain't on stage. Black person ain't on stage. You go there. That's just a fact. There's no real way around it. That's part of what we tend to do musically. We're all about what's strictly about what's in the future of the music, and so it's when we have a musical form, and when we feel like it's no longer serving the purpose that we want it to serve, we pretty much abandon it.
Now,
it's just a fact.
It is.
That's what I've observed.
Right, but do you think that's dangerous and a detriment? Because now here it is, we're laying bricks of history and lineage, and then
Well, I do think that it's something we birth it ourselves, and when you say that means patronize it, play it, and at least I would say this, when I have my classes, when I'm teaching poetry, when I'm talking about American literature, I'm probably going to end up playing them some music, some jazz and some blues, okay?
Okay.
Because I want my students to know that there's an intimate connection between literature and music.
Yes.
And so that they can kind of understand it. And so at least to understand it and appreciate it, and try to dig it, so that because understanding it to me as a writer, as a black writer, it's essential to understand the blues. If I'm
Yes.
I could also, I think it's essential to me, particularly because of where I come from, where my people come from, Oklahoma, South Carolina, and to me, it's like that soundtrack, partially of my family.
Yes.
And I would say, legitimately, if you're from wherever you're from, you should know the music of, or at least try to familiarize yourself with the music of that place. And here, since there's a strong Caribbean vibe, you hear a lot of that, the Caribbean music.
Mm-hmm.
You have the parades and everything, and it's really part of the lifeblood of New York City. And that's what they and for them, for the Caribbean folk of New York, that is their blues.
Yeah.
That's their blues. That's their folk music, and it's right that they celebrate that. It is their down home music when they reach back into the archives and play the old ska,
Right.
and the old school reggae. That's that's part of that musical heritage, and there is a kind of a blues, a different. I think in a lot of good reggae, for instance, there's an embrace of a kind of duality of life, of pain and joy, and an understanding of race in both musics. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
So and both musics come out of a historical circumstance of slavery.
Yes.
So
Yes, which brings it full circle. So, do you believe those from our Caribbean side of heritage and those from the predominantly African American side of the heritage that frown upon both ska, dancehall roots and reggae and blues and roots and folk and even the hip hop right now, they parallel that to slavery, which is why they don't embrace it. Because you have a lot of white folk that really embrace Caribbean music the way they embrace blues, and sometimes more so than our own people.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that it's a real complicated question. I think like if I'm a blues musician trying to make a living here in the United States, then I'm going to be pretty used to white folks coming up, to being part of that scenario.
Right.
And that's just a fact of the matter. So I guess I'm not.
Well, here, let me be clear. This is not a, this is not a, I don't want to see white people here or nothing like that. You enjoy it, it doesn't matter what
Right.
it is. If you enjoy it and you support it,
go for it.
yeah, because the reality of the situation is...
But I think the other part of that is to have some respect for the history of the people of the music that have produced the music,
Right.
and to understand where it comes from and to acknowledge where it comes from.
Right.
And I think that is part of the issue that needs to be addressed. It's one thing to celebrate and clap your hands and dance to a music, and it's another thing to understand the history of that music and how you are part of that history and how the country has helped create the circumstances around that music. You know what I'm saying?
Yes, I sure do. And,
Yeah.
and I would add that black people, African American people, though we tend to move on for whatever reason may it be, because, most people, when it's not cult or underground anymore, it loses its romance to it, But nevertheless, you still need to reach back, support, celebrate, and pass it down in terms of generations, because this is our story.
Right.
And it is it's a rock and a hard place, because it turns into, well, who are you who we talking to? Who are you talking to? Are you telling a white audience, not you personally, just in general, telling a white audience you need to appreciate this and respect this when they're the ones paying for the tickets? Or are we telling our people you need to appreciate this and respect it because it comes from you? You know what I mean?
Well, that I think what that response leads us, into that intersection between literature and the music, and that's what I try to do. By writing about these figures, these musical and artistic figures, and because I think that they just need to be remembered.
Absolutely.
And that when we write about their histories, we start to understand them more, and we start to understand ourselves more.
Right, the connection.
Right,
bridging the gap.
The things that we are dealing with in terms of ownership of our art and agency over our art are not that dissimilar from the way that our forebears from 100 years ago, 150 years ago were dealing, and we can see the roots there.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Brother, it was really intense and groovy rapping with you and talking about the blues.
Thank you for bringing me on the show, and I love to see any blues fans out there. If y'all are interested in blues, I hope I'll run across you someday, somewhere.
Well, at first, why don't you tell them where they could find you on social media, where they could find your books.
Yeah. Well, I have a website. It's TyhimbaJess.net. It's you spell my name, TYEHIMBAJESS .net. If you Google me, you'll find me pretty quick. And you can go on my website. I'm on, various social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, just by my name, nothing special.
Groovy. And is the new book out, or it's
It will be out. The new book Olio will be out on April 5th. You can order it. You can pre-order it on Amazon, and if you order it from the actual publishing company, Wave, you get 30% off up until April 1st.
Okay, guys. As you know.
Well, thank you.
Oh, no. Thank you, brother. And you all know, I will see you next week. And as per usual, you've been bluesing. We're talking about the blues. And if you don't do nothing, keep God first and keep on bluesing.
All right.